This image of Alaa Salah defiantly leading protesters in Sudan has become an iconic image of the Sudanese revolution, catapulting the Sudanese struggle into headlines across the world. But Sudan is just one example of mass demonstrations in recent years. Egypt, South Africa, and Zimbabwe have all had their share. But do protests work? Is there a surge in protests across the continent? And what is the role of women in both large and small-scale protests? Welcome to Our Voices. I'm Ayan Bior with my colleagues Haiti Adams-Fitzpatrick, Ariane Itagishaka, and joining us for the first time is VOA Africa's social media producer, Tatenda Gumbo.
Thank you guys.
Hi,
I'm very excited to be here.
How are you?
Yeah, you guys.
All right. From Sudan to Algeria, women protest demanding lasting change in their societies. The military ousted President Omar al-Bashir of Sudan just days after the release of the images of Alaa Salah chanting with protesters. But while Salah's images brought attention to Sudan's uprising and the front line of the role women play in the protests, some say she has been inflated as an icon of the revolution, including Salah herself.
The image of 22-year-old Alaa Salah chanting to Sudan's protesters from the roof of a car quickly went viral. Picked up by international media, Salah was dubbed a symbol of Sudan's revolution and the role of women in the uprising. Salah tells VOA she got caught up in the moment and her time in the spotlight was not planned.
It began when I was in the revolution area and found a group of girls there behind the car. Then I asked the girls whether I could cheer them. I climbed on the car and chanted and cheered with them.
Sudan's female protesters found their voice after 3 decades of oppression under President Omar al-Bashir's Islamist rule.
In Sudan, life was very difficult in the period of al-Bashir. He destroyed the life of the people.
The military ousted Bashir just a day after Salah's image went viral. But not all of Sudan's protesters welcomed Salah as a symbol of their struggle.
Salah is one of the protators, but of course she's not the icon of the revolution of Sudan. Many people who died for this, they deserve to be icons more than her.
But many, like 24-year-old Nisrim El-Zarim, still admire Salah for bringing global attention to Sudan.
She's a courage girl because it needs a lot of courageousness to stand up like she did and to motivate the people like she did. And for me, I think she's lucky because sometimes you were in the right place, doing the right thing with the right camera. And that's what happened with her.
As for Salah herself, she takes a humbler view of her role in Sudan's uprising.
I am just one of the million demonstrators. They went out to demand freedom, change, justice, and peace. It's not necessary anymore to climb on a car. I can be in any place to cheer with the people.
As they struggle forward from authoritarian rule, the role that Salah and other women played in Sudan's revolution will not be forgotten. Ruth Helmendorp for VOA News, Khartoum.
Women have been showing up at these protests. We know that women have been involved in activism for quite forever, right? But the problem is that the narrative that have been solely focused on male figureheads. We know the Mandelas very well. We know the Kwame Nkrumahs, the Steve Bikos, the Patrice Lumumbas. They're the ones we remember because that's what history told us. But now that we are seeing that the times that we are in is a time of empowerment and enabling women, we're beginning to see them on the front line. We're beginning to see them in images as if it's a new thing, but they have been always involved in these movements. It's just that I think also that they have been characterized as those who are they're doing activism only in social issues and then gender issues, but we see them on a political front as well.
Right.
Well, but I think that women have always showed up, to your point, Ariane, because they have the most to lose. And Sudan is a really good example of that. They have public order laws that are extremely restrictive towards women. These laws dictate how a woman dresses, who she associates with. So what we saw during these protests is women showing up to say that we are going to correct the laws of the past to make sure that our human rights are protected. Alaa Salah, for example, she showed up for those very reasons.
And it's also about how many people show up, because size matters, and who shows up. I mean, women have shown up in large numbers more often than they get credit for. But I wonder about Alaa Salah. Was it the woman herself? Or was it the image of the woman that got worldwide attention?
That's a really good question.
Yeah. That's a good question, Haiti, because I think that if we look at social media and how, the uprising was happening of real time on social media, you saw that from December up until April, you have the social media hashtag going on, Sudan protests, things like that. But it wasn't until we saw this image show up where you had international media, jumping onto this. What's interesting enough is that what shows you how plugged in the protesters were from the beginning of this protest on December 18th would be an example of American rapper J. Cole, someone who has nothing to do with Sudan but tweeted solidarity with these protesters. And from that day, 28,000 retweets. Now, if you go through that thread, if you guys have a chance to look at it, probably have it on the screen there. But you can see people from the continent, Sudanese people and diasporans, who are basically saying to him, thank you, and here's what's going on. Here are videos, here are protests. Look at these images. And that was
happened
powerful.
on social media. I always say if women were the engine of the protests in Sudan, social media was the oil that kept them going. And I actually spoke to Lana Haroun. She was the woman who took the photo of Alaa Salah. And she said exactly what you just said, that the only media who cared about Sudan in the early days was social media.
Yeah, and social media is a great platform. I think it's a perfect tool to use when you're trying to rally, especially to let the international community know what's going on. But I think also sometimes social media can play a detrimental role with fake news and rumors and things like that. But I think that, as you mentioned, social media, it really does play a lot in the protests.
We live in the age of video as well. As much as social media, it's also about video. And if it's not recorded on video by multiple people, did it even really happen? As far as everybody else cares.
As they say. Yeah. I mean, I think a big thing for me is just being able to say that when these protests are happening, does it turn around into policy? Sometimes we see this happening on the continent, see it happening around the world, and then when you go back and say, okay, what has happened since then, since the uprising ended, since changes were made, a regime changes, whatever it might be, you don't see any policy changes. And for an example, in Angola, the government wanted to push a change to the abortion laws to decriminalize women who had, in certain instances, maybe if you your health and or if you were raped. And the parliament pushed back so hard, they actually decided to go ahead and say, if you get any type of abortion, it is all illegal. And women marched and they went out there and parliament decided to kind of hold off, but status quo stayed. Nothing ever changed in that penal code.
That is such an important point in terms of how, it's such an important question, does the movement really at the end of the day translate into policy? I think we saw an example of that with what happened with the Women's March here in Washington. When it began, it started out as this really admirable movement. They had the numbers, they had the visibility. Everything seemed to be, people seemed to be united on particular issues. It brought women's issues, women's rights issues to the fore again. It activated women politically again. But I think where it all went wrong for me was that women were united in what they stood against, but they didn't necessarily seem united in what they stood for.
I think Sierra Leone and Liberia would be a great example of how women really organized properly and actually saw change in the laws. And it's something that maybe Angola can learn from. The women had to organize.
Right, absolutely. And I also think that Sudan, again, is another good example because they are insistent on creating actual change, not just overthrowing Bashir, but changing the entire government to make sure that they have the policies that they want in place.
I think sometimes we also become hooked on the image, on the imagery, and we forget about the person, the life they had before that moment and their life in the wake of the moment. Look at Rosa Parks. I mean, she had a life of political activism before the bus boycotts and when she became this icon of the civil rights movement. But that her life, her personal life, didn't necessarily improve after that.
And she received threats.
Death threats. And people people get hooked on the image. But who really stops and really cares at the end of the day what happens in the story afterwards? But we want to hear your thoughts as well. We spoke about social media, and that is where you can talk to us. Catch us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can search there for our handle at VOA Our Voices. You can also use this hashtag, VOA Our Voices. We're on WhatsApp as well. Our number there is on your screen.
we want to remind you that you are the fifth person on this panel, and it's time for your voices to be heard. Here's some of what some of you said about protest movements. We'll be right back.
People who have been staying here for 3 weeks are planning to stay more. They never pay attention for what's happening in the closed rooms or negotiations. They only ask for justice, for freedom, and for civilian government.
So I participated there not only to seek freedom, dignity, social justice, or to call for human rights in Egypt, but also for my rights as a woman. I was arrested on Saturday, December 17, 2011. I was dragged, beaten, stripped, and there were around 15 soldiers were beating me, sexually harassing me, touching private area in my body.
Frustration is one of the things that drives women to protest and also wanting to see real change. If it had not been for the women to go ahead themselves and protest, then there would not have been, maybe today we'll still not have women being able to vote.
What drives women to the front line of protests is majorly equality and respect. Now, equality and respect are intertwined. Women want to be respected. Women want to feel among the society. They don't want to be relegated at the background. They want to be at the front line. They want to speak. They want to talk. They want to be at the aim of affairs. They want to be where men are. So it's very important for women to be respected. It's very important for men to be equal to men, especially in offices, in homes, and any other place in the society. They want to be heard.
You're with Our Voices. Welcome back. Africa has seen a wave of protests that led to regime change in 3 countries, Sudan, Algeria, and Zimbabwe. As VOA's Mariama Diallo reports, activists are now watching to see if the changes they were hoping for will actually take place.
Months of demonstrations helped Sudanese people end the 30-year rule of President Omar al-Bashir. Sudanese activists want to see major change in governance, says analyst Raymond Gilpin.
They want institutions that serve all the people. So over the short term, they have replaced an individual. They've gotten rid of al-Bashir, but the wheels of institutional change are grinding a little bit more slowly.
Large protests in Algeria also helped push former Algerian leader Abdelaziz Bouteflika.
Algeria, as you know, started with the price hikes, and then we had the issue of the 5th term for Bouteflika, and people had had enough.
Bouteflika has been replaced by the head of the upper house of parliament until a presidential election in July. Algeria's army chief, who was instrumental in Bouteflika's downfall, says the military will watch over the transition.
In Algeria, like in most countries, kind of use security and the military interchangeably. And the security that matters to most of the citizens is not what the military can provide. It's what the police provide: law and order, and the absence of civil unrest.
In Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe was replaced after 37 years, but governance changed very little. Soaring inflation, fuel costs, and shortages of basic foods sparked months of protests that escalated into riots.
The fact that we've had such explosive and costly, in terms of lives and property, riots and unrest in Zimbabwe speaks to the fact that that state-society relationship is still fractured.
In Uganda, people protested against a constitutional amendment that allows President Yoweri Museveni to run for another term. Opponents accuse Museveni of using security crackdowns to hold on to power. At a recent talk in Washington, activist Scovia Arinetwe recalls being thrown in jail shortly after major surgery.
And I was in police custody for 5 days. No medical attention, nor being produced in court.
While protesters keep pushing for change, the full impact of their fight remains unclear in Uganda and elsewhere in Africa. Mariama Diallo, VOA News, Washington.
You know, this is so interesting. I was reading an article from the global think tank Carnegie Europe, which really explores what's behind what they say is a rise in recent years of protests around the world. But I wasn't so much interested in the frequency of protests, because I think we're feeling a little bit of that on the continent as well. But I was interested in impact and outcomes. Are these protests really effective? There's so much at stake for us on the continent.
Well, effective or not, Haiti, I mean, we know that the protests are becoming more and more obvious as regime change techniques around the world. I mean, whether they are prepared and arranged by the military, the people themselves, or the Western powers that say that such and such leader is not upholding democratic values and must go. I mean, we're seeing it right now in the news. When you turn on the news and you see the case of Venezuela, how the superpowers are fighting who is going to be the president. You see, we saw it in Libya in the very recent past. We saw it in Ivory Coast when Gbagbo, the French were very vocal on what they wanted to happen. You know, we know of even the military presence in Ivory Coast then, who was really active in trying to remove Gbagbo. We've seen it in different countries, Iraq as well.
And it's not just these days, but the fights in the open as well.
Yeah, and we know that civil society also, when we talk about influences, civil societies in these countries are heavily dependent on Western funding. I mean, USAID have acknowledged that as well. So we see that when we look at and we follow the money trail, we can tell exactly what's about to happen, if it's a regime change or not.
And it's not just regime change. I think it's also keeping the old leaders in power. Critics of Museveni in Uganda will tell you that the reason why he's still president is because the U.S. wants him to be president.
Well, I think it's about how you also design your protest, how it's organized, because you've got to know what you're going to the streets for, and you've got to know what the risks are going to be involved. I look at how the anti-apartheid movement, which became a global movement, how that was organized. I mean, you had all these people around the world who were supporting the movement, but everybody knew what the goal was, and everybody knew that this was something that was fundamentally organized and led by the South Africans, and they led the fight and asked the rest of the world to join them. I think the movement also had, you know, it was very fortunate in the sense that it had people who were willing to die for the cause. They were willing to present their bodies on the streets. It also included sanctions against UN sanctions and other sanctions against the then South African government. There was an economic quarantine of the country, and I think there were divestiture campaigns, and all those other elements seemed to line up. And then there was also geopolitical timing. I mean, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and the United States no longer needed South Africa as a proxy in Southern Africa against other communist proxies in the region. So I think sometimes the stars align and all those things line up, but I think it happens once in a blue moon, and I don't know if in the near future for any other African nation it might line up just all the elements that way.
Have the right leaders come on board.
Protests are messy and they don't always work out beautifully.
Right, absolutely. But you know what, I mean, just the fact that it was theirs is, I think that's something that I have seen in Sudan as well. And if you guys look at some of the images from the Sudanese protests, you'll see Sudanese violinists come in and lead the crowd. The chantings are very Sudanese. And I think the fact that they decided to control the narrative and control the images that go out into the world, that's one of the reasons why this particular protest was successful. Because remember, Sudan has had multiple protests in the past, but this time it worked, to your point, Haiti, because it was extremely organized, but because it was also extremely theirs.
And we didn't see a lot of violence in those protests.
There was no violence, and that was on purpose, because the organizers told the protests to make sure that it is peaceful. Because if it is not peaceful, the government then has a reason to go after them.
I really don't want to be a wet blanket, but at the end of the day, it is still a coup. You know, I get worried when the change that we see protests, but then at the end of the day, change is effected through the military, through a coup, or through, whether it's a palace coup or political coup, it's always a coup, and that leadership is removed inside the party, and change is not happening at the ballot box. That makes me nervous, because I wonder what that says about our journey on this journey of democracy. What does that say about our future if that is how we're affecting change? It's worrying.
Haiti, I will have to say, as your Southern African neighbor, it sounds sounds like you're talking about Zimbabwe.
Yes, that is definitely. No, that is definitely. We were so relieved when we saw the end of Robert Mugabe. We never thought we'd see the day.
But I think a lot of people were relieved, and I think that it showed out as everything played out. You saw that the military were the ones that said that this was not a coup, this was a military intervention. But then you saw the military and civilians together that Saturday protesting for Mugabe to go out. But I think what's very interesting, as we're seeing in Sudan right now, where it's, the people in Sudan are saying we don't want to have any of the old guard.
Right.
You saw ZANU-PF itself, the ruling party in Zimbabwe, oust Mugabe on their own. It wasn't that the people were actually ousting him, because protests had happened for years and years.
But also
absolutely, and remember,
exactly. And so when he left, it wasn't because the people did it per se. It was because internally, as ZANU-PF as a party, with these alleged factions, you saw that splinter happen, and then you see the same military group a year and a half later being alleged to be beating people, to be killing people, and also sexually assaulting women. Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the ballot box. I just want to say that it's preferable to have change through the ballot box. But if you have a dictator or a president that's been in power for 30 years, the ballot box really becomes something that just can't be achieved.
It's like theater.
Yeah, absolutely, it's like theater.
But at the end of the day, change is incremental. Sometimes we want a revolution, but we've got to settle for evolution. Wait for change to evolve instead of just that asteroid hits the Earth and we get what we want. Sometimes we have to be patient and know that first protest, the biggest one, is not necessarily going to be the last.
Right. And it has to be
Let me just get in there really quick and talk about social media. And I know we've been talking about this a lot, just the role of social media, but also the government and their pushback on social media. We saw this a lot, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Sudan, prior to the end of this protest, but they really have been pushing back. But I am interested to see how protesters themselves are saying, wait a minute, we can find ways to still get our message out there. And that's been really interesting.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of change, after the break, we'll introduce you to women who are bold enough to take leading roles in revolutions aimed at altering governments and change the course of history. We'll be right back in a moment. On Our Voices, we're talking about the news and issues you're talking about.
Sharing stories of development and growth across Africa,
around the world, and in our lives.
Topics that inform, empower,
and change the rules.
It's time for Our Voices
with me, Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick,
and Hadiza Kiari,
and Ayan Bior,
and Orion Itangi Shaka.
Join us on Facebook at VOA Our Voices.
It's time for Our Voices.
Welcome back. Today on Our Voices, we're talking about women demanding change in their countries, and we highlight their contribution in a segment called Women to Watch.
If you're on the streets of Khartoum, you might see the painted images of anti-government protesters killed in clashes with security forces. Now, the woman behind the paintings is Asil Diab, a Sudanese graffiti artist who says that painting victims is her way of honoring them.
On the streets of Khartoum, Asil Diab paints images of anti-government protesters killed in clashes with security forces. She says her art helps unite people.
And once I start painting a martyr in the streets, people as well, the audience, they stop and ask as well. And like I said, it connects me with the families and the families with the public. And there's an immediate connection between everyone that walks by the artwork.
Diab, who lives in Qatar, returned to her homeland earlier this year. She planned to join the demonstrations, but that changed after she heard about the protesters who had died.
And once I got here, I heard a lot of stories about the martyrs, and it was very emotional, and I just knew that I had to do something about that.
Diab started visiting the families of protesters who were killed. Then she began painting their portraits at the memorial on the walls of the buildings where they once lived.
Regarding the painting that Asil painted, actually, for me, it renewed the memory of Abdul-Azim becoming a martyr. Whenever I see this painting, I feel that Abdul-Azim is still here with us.
Diab's work now includes depictions of people killed in earlier confrontations, like Adila Mustafa's son, Mus'ab. who was killed in 2013.
لما الصورة دي اترسمت أنا كنت ما موجودة.
When this painting was made, I wasn't there. Then I came and I was surprised. For me, yes, it's a painful memory. My nerves were tense and I cried.
Anti-government protests broke out late December over bread price hikes and fuel shortage. Since then, at least 50 people have been killed. Pioneer of Sudan's modern art Rashid Diab, no relation, says Asil Diab's work is empowering the protest movement.
Freedom of expression in painting is very important. It gives the actual value to the Revolutionary Act. It fuels the Revolutionary Act. It increases its power, fame, and importance. It creates the pillars of a future civilized presence.
As Diab prepared to leave Sudan, she expressed hope that the next time she returns, there will be no more protest victims to honor. Naba Muhyiddin for VOA News, Khartoum.
Wow. That's really inspiring.
That is amazing.
Art is powerful,
right,
isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the way people can connect to different ways, you know, painting and, you know, just art. Art is
great. We're talking about visual imagery. I think that is such a powerful medium to send the message of what people truly went through.
Protest, yes.
And it lasts for generations as well.
Right.
Well, by now you have probably seen the image of Alaa Salah multiple times. And in fact, we heard from her earlier on this program. But have you met the woman who took this image, now deemed as iconic? Her name is Lana Hago El Fadil Haroun, and she is a woman to watch. I spoke to her and she told me that she eagerly covered the protests in Sudan because she wanted to control the narrative and ensure that history told the story of the Sudanese revolution through the frame of the Sudanese themselves.
So who do you think deserves a shout out? Use the hashtag VOA Our Voices and tell us who you think is a woman to watch. I'll be looking out for them.
Be sure to watch Our Voices on the VOA website where you can find the world's top news stories.
And that's all the time we have for Our Voices this week. The last word goes to the late Miriam Makeba, a South African singer, songwriter, and anti-apartheid activist. She used her voice to say, "I have one thing in common with the emerging Black nations of Africa. We both have voices, and we are discovering what we can do with them."
Well, Miriam Makeba also used her voice to sing. And so we leave you with the protest song, Ndodem Nyama. On behalf of all of us here at Our Voices and the Voice of America, thank you so very much for watching. And we thank our co-host today, Tatenda Gumbo. Thank you for being with us. We hope you'll come back soon.
Yes, ma'am. Welcome.
From all of us.